Next slide, Cameron. All right. Thanks for joining, everyone. And thank you for the introduction, Brian. So I'll give a quick overview on AES. AES is a power company, works globally in about 14 countries. We have 30 plus gigawatts in operation, which includes renewable and non-renewable generation. I specifically work for AES Clean Energy, which is the renewable arm of AES within the United States. So we have about 4 gigawatts plus in operation, 40 gigawatts plus in development. We work all over the US, and we have 2 power plants that are in operation in Kauai, working with KIUC. One is the PMRF Microgrid, and the second is the AES Hawaii facility, also known as IPO to KIUC, both photovoltaic and battery storage. So we thought it would be a great opportunity to, co-present with KIUC here, the failures as well as the successes that we've had, and what we are seeing on their grid, which is pretty interesting.
All right, and here I'll start taking it from here. I just wanted to give a little bit of background on the electric grid here on Kauai. We are the sole electric utility here on the island. We are completely islanded from any other island in the state. We're vertically integrated, so we generate, we transmit, and we distribute power throughout the island, which is roughly about 34,000 meters. We've got about 134 full-time employees the last time I checked. We do transmit. Our transmission voltage is, you might consider it sub-transmission. It's 171 miles and roughly about 1,300 miles of 1247 kV distribution. And our loads have been fluctuating between 35 megawatts and 80 megawatts, which is an all-time peak back in August of 2019, pre-COVID levels. We do have 117 megawatts of oil-fired generation capacity, and we traditionally have had high rates for our members, which is really the driver for us to go renewable when we get to the future slides. So our rates have been fluctuating anywhere between 31 and 39.5 cents a kilowatt hour over the last 3 years for an average residential member. We do have connected roughly about 106 megawatts of solar nameplate at the inverter level, and 40% of that is customer owned or member owned behind the utility meter. We do have 16 megawatts worth of hydro generation nameplate, 7 megawatts of biomass, and in addition, we have 58 megawatts of BESS nameplate and 240 megawatt hours of energy behind that. Now, just to kind of give some of the results of what we've been striving for, it's really started to pay off, especially over the past year, or even starting in January of this year. If you compare the increase in rates, even with inflation and with the volatility in the price of oil, you'll see that what we've been doing to transform our grid from conventional diesel power generation source to a renewable source that we've locked in to long-term PPA contracts with, it's really started to pay off for us in that we're now the lowest priced utility in the state on every island, and we have not seen the increase that the other islands have seen in terms of the utility rates. Now, not to say we don't care about reliability as we've been progressing toward 100% renewable. You'll see here the year 2020 and 2021, we've had the best SAIDI minutes here in the state as compared to the other main islands. Here's a typical day in the life of dispatch here on the island. This was actually taken from data from September 27th, just a couple weeks ago. And I thought this was a good slide because it kind of showed a really, really good solar day in which we actually went 100% renewable. We've gone over 100% renewable, over 2,000 hours worth here on the island. And you can kind of see by the color coding, I tried to match it up with, the type of source it was. So you've got your yellow, which is your kind of your direct to grid solar here that we do measure. This is predominantly our major solar farms that we have on the island, which are two 12 megawatt solar farm nameplate. We've got a 6 megawatt direct to grid solar and another about 1 megawatt. So the combination of that is seen here in yellow. In blue on top of that is the hydro of what it was doing that day. In orange, or this kind of pinkish color, this is actually the solar PV coupled with battery that we do set point dispatch throughout the day, as long as we have the state of charge to do that. And so you'll see here, even though the solar day starts, you don't really see a lot of that energy until midday and later on during our evening peak, which is when we really try to drive down our need for requiring more diesel generation to turn on. In green, we have our biomass plant, which is usually fluctuating between 4 and 6 megawatts. And then in black, we have our conventional diesel generation. And so you'll see we really haven't been seeing, the coincident peaks that we were pre-COVID. And this could be a combination of just pre-COVID levels at night, but also it could be a combination of more solar and the storage going on with members that's offsetting their nighttime peak as well that we don't measure. So that could be playing into this. So challenges of operating a high renewable grid. As a lot of you folks do know, it's a seesaw. And conventionally for everyone, it's always been, you're always trying to balance frequency and voltage with your synchronous machine generation and your load. But however, for us, it's been a little bit different over the past few years. It's been a balance of our grid following inverters that have been set point dispatched in a steady state time frame, added on to our synchronous machine generation. And then on the other side of the seesaw, we have our direct to grid DER, which is subtracting from the load that we're trying to balance. So it's a negative load in a sense for steady state. But then the additional thing that's thrown a curveball for us has been the inverters operating in grid following mode, but also operating in droop. And the reason we say that, I put that on this side of the seesaw, is there's a delay in the grid following response of the inverters while they're operating in fast frequency droop response. And that delay actually causes an imbalance in our frequency on our grid. So if you think about it in a sense that if we have a system event where we have frequency operating outside of a deadband of a droop response, what will happen is frequency will go low, and 50 milliseconds later, you'll see a fast frequency response in our Droop inverter-based resources. That then will drive the response, and the aggressiveness of that Droop response will then drive frequency to go up. However, there's that delay. And when that frequency goes up, and if your aggressive Droop response is too much, it's driving frequency up, which is then causing your synchronous machine generation and your grid following inverters in steady state to set point their dispatch down. Now, if they're too aggressive on their side, driving frequency down, that causes frequency to go down again, causing an ultimate Droop response on your grid following inverters. And so you're always kind of seesawing back and forth like this. And that's what we're seeing right now. So here's a event from our historian. In yellow, we have our system frequency. In blue, we have the load profile for the entire day. This is from midnight to midnight. In teal and red, we have, we're just looking at the megawatt output of our two 12 megawatt direct to grid solar farms. And I thought this was a good slide because it shows how system frequency fluctuates as our larger direct to grid solar farms are fluctuating throughout the day. And you can see when they start up in the morning, we didn't have a lot of clouds and frequency was doing pretty good. It looks like right around 9:30 in the morning, frequency was set point a little higher than 60 hertz. And I think that's probably due to the accounting of just trying to stay above and kind of being proactive so that when frequency does drive down, we're not having a lot of fast frequency Droop responses when frequency goes low. But you do see when you see a megawatt decrease, and we do often see pretty high rate of change of megawatt decrease here. That's driving frequency down, synchronous generation kicks in, driving frequency up, and it's a seesaw battle back and forth all day. This was actually pretty good for us. Frequency didn't really go above 60.2 hertz on this day, and below 59.9 on this day. But this is an everyday occurrence for us. Back in April of 2021, we actually had an island-wide blackout. And this was due to steady state oscillations that were occurring. We were running 100% renewable at the time. System load was 45 megawatts. And what was the trigger of the event was actually found out where we were just oscillating between our grid following inverters and our synchronous machine generation that was online. We had our single largest combustion turbine operating in synchronous condensing mode. And at the time, 80% of our generation was from grid following IBRs. And then the single grid forming mode IBR that we had at the time was actually offline. So in a sense, we were trying to control the grid strictly with grid following inverters and the remaining synchronous machines that we had online, which was at 20%. What we found was basically as something that you guys might see in some of the modeling that you guys have been doing is our grid following inverters with their delay caused an oscillation in frequency, which caused a further magnitude of amplification of oscillation between our grid following inverters across the island. And so we start getting into these power swings between our synchronous generation and our grid following inverters. To the point here in blue on this dashed line where we actually start load shedding per our load shed scheme, which then drives our seesaw load to drop off, causing frequency to go high, causing grid following inverters to push out more, pull back on their real power, which continues to drive our synchronous machines to push back out, as a response. The other thing that we found out as a result of this is at the time we were operating our grid following inverters with a very aggressive droop at this time. It was at 0.8%. We've since increased that droop percent to 3% across the island on our fast frequency response. But that was one of the lessons learned there. And the other lesson learned is the inverter-based fast frequency response on some of our systems was only playing a portion into the droop response. Another portion of it was a plant controller also operating in droop to help provide a slower speed droop response, and that was 350 milliseconds. We found that to be a little bit too slow for us, and so we've since had that removed, and our fast frequency response at 50 milliseconds is our true droop response right now.
Okay, so I included this slide just to, it's from NOC, but kind of to set the stage for what grid-connected inverter technologies should have in terms of capabilities. Similar to what Cameron was saying, having a fast frequency response is kind of crucial for many reasons, but one reason here is that it helps slow down the DFDT if you have a faster, quicker response. As you can see, as everyone knows, with synchronous generators, they have an inertial response. You can amplify it through a fast governor response. Another benefit to having a faster response is you can prevent some of the oscillations that could be possible in a low inertia grid, like KIUCs with more renewables. So generally, as most of you folks know, most converters connected to the grid are grid following, detects your frequency, acts through a droop after post delay, and then respond. We expect grid forming, through simulations, but also in practice too, because it's controlling its voltage phasor to have a more instantaneous response or inertial type response. So those are the characteristics that we kind of wanted to see while connecting grid forming to KIUC's grid and see how it plays out. And in the next few slides, we'll go through a few successes we've had. But yeah, just something that we want to kind of achieve moving forward for all of our plants connected to these types of grids.
So going back to my nice artwork here, we consider, I guess up till today, grid forming mode inverters to be on the left side of this seesaw. So it's going to help to, as Alston was saying, to maintain that voltage phasor and then the inherent and act as a voltage source. And then based on the incoming voltage phasor coming into the inverter terminals, that difference in phasor voltage, magnitude, and phase angle would help to provide the P and Q output from the grid forming mode inverter with zero delay. That's the main point there.
Okay, so I'm gonna go more specifically into one of our projects, and in combination with other power plants that KIUC has, we'll see some of the results with grid forming. So the PMRF Microgrid is an AES project that's operating currently. It's a 19 megawatt DC, 14 megawatt AC photovoltaic and battery storage power plant. It has about 5 hours of storage duration. So earlier this year, back in August, we converted the entire plant from grid following to grid forming as per KIUC's request. So it's currently running in grid forming. It primarily is a plant that is an asset to KIUC. We respond to dispatch set points sent by the KIUC operator and send electricity to the grid. We also combine that on top of the dispatch with ancillary services such as frequency and voltage ride-throughs for our converters to remain online for a longer duration to help support the grid. We also provide active and reactive power support or frequency voltage regulation. Since this power plant is within the Pacific Missile Range facility, which is a naval base out there, it can also provide microgrid services. So if the naval facility needs to run a mission or disconnect from the grid entirely, the PMRF Microgrid helps provide powers during an outage or just during their missions while disconnected from the grid. It allows seamless transitions between a grid-tied mode and moving to an islanded mode, and also provides some Blackstart capabilities.
So some of the differences that we've seen or lessons learned between grid following and grid forming response is actually, as we've started to look at the differences, we've actually been learning a lot about the synchronous machine generation that we have had on the system this whole time that we never really, picked up on until we started looking at the actual responses of the inverter-based resource. And one of the things that I've learned about is that our conventional synchronous generation has been historically putting out subsynchronous oscillations to the grid. Namely, this is one of our diesel generators here, and this is its real power output. And we've seen when this unit's on, it's actually pushing out subsynchronous frequencies in the 3, the 6, the 10, and 20 hertz frequencies onto the grid. And you can really tell that because when you see one of these synchronous generations online, our 60 hertz frequency on the island gets really noisy. It looks just like this. And it's like, well, how come it's not closer to 60 hertz? Well, it's because of all those subsynchronous oscillation frequencies are actually causing this noise here. That not necessarily is a bad thing. However, as a result of this kind of noisy frequency being seen at our grid following inverter terminals, they're also responding to that subsynchronous oscillation. And so it's almost like the noise that's being produced by some of our synchronous machine driving frequency noise as causing our real power of our inverter-based resources to also have a real power that looks somewhat noisy. And you can see that in red right here. As compared to the grid forming mode inverter at PMRF, you can see that real power output on the same time scale, looking at the same frequency, is not as noisy. Now, what you will notice here is there's a spike going on the real power on this green trend, and it's happening once every 47 or 48 seconds. That is not an expected thing to be happening. This happened quite a while ago. I forgot exactly what the driver was or what the root cause was, but we know this is not something that should be happening. But this is a good comparison of the differences between grid forming and grid following when it comes to steady state response. This is also another way that we look at the comparison is when we actually have a synchronous generator trip. And so here in pink, we had our single largest combustion turbine back in November of 2021. It tripped offline and it was pushing out at about 26 megawatts at the time. And this was about 5:30 in the morning. So we didn't have any solar on the system, just our battery energy storage. When that occurred, frequency dropped to about 59 hertz. And we had a really high rate of change of frequency. I think this was about 28 hertz per second. On the third plot down in yellow here, or in red, you'll see we have a grid forming inverter in red here. And you can see as soon as frequency starts to decline, almost instantaneously, you'll see a real power response. And this is actually an inertial response type from this grid forming manufacturer with zero delay. And this is as compared to the purple and the yellow real power trends at the very bottom. And these are both grid following inverters. And the difference here is not just the magnitude difference and how they seesaw back and forth, but it's also the delay that you're seeing in the grid following response. And the difference between X and O here is about 2 cycles. The other thing to note is because of that delay between the grid following responding to a fast frequency or between frequency dropping, is you're noticing, or we are noticing that we look at negative power as power from the IBR to the grid. So as this IBR is pushing out its peak power, because of that delay in the grid following, it's actually pushing out its max peak power here. And by that time, the grid forming inverter is actually pulling back because frequency is actually recovered. And because now you're getting the seesaw between the grid following and grid forming, where they're just going back and forth. And you can see that even if you look at a spike here, you have a minimum real power spike from our grid following inverters, but then you have a kind of a peak in our grid forming inverter, and they just start fighting each other the whole way. And that's affecting our system frequency. This was the same generator here in blue. This was another trip that it had. Luckily, it was only putting out about 8.5 megawatts at the time. However, on the bottom, we have 3 trends. Site 1 is a grid forming inertial type response, and that's seen in black. And that has virtually 0 delay to frequency dropping. Site 2 is a grid following droop response, and you'll see there's a delay there in red in its response. And then in site number 3, which is grid forming, it did respond with virtually 0 delay. However, the point to take here is even though an inverter is in grid forming mode, it really matters on what actually is going on in this black box of the algorithm of the inverter and how it's responding to frequency. You could have a manufacturer say that they're operating in grid forming mode, but it could have an inertial type response, or it could be following just a droop response. And you'll see that here. We've got 2 manufacturers connected, or 2 vendors, and they're each putting out different types of fast frequency response to system frequency going out of the deadband.
Yeah, so at KIUC for our plants in Kauai, we do have a wider ride-through requirement. It's not, so the graphs over here show a comparison of, what our plants do in Kauai versus an IEEE 1547 requirement. So it is much wider in Kauai, but that's not to say that, the grid goes up to 64 hertz or 54 hertz, and we expect everything to come back to normal. It's just that for grids in Kauai in general, it can require a more stringent requirement to remain online and help support the grid. So our plants also respond in less than 30 milliseconds with grid forming to any frequency or voltage deviation. But overall, having a larger ride-through enables developers or owners like AES to remain online for a longer duration and continue supporting the grid.
This is another, lesson learned for us here. This was a response between grid following inverter and grid forming inverter. And this was due to an unbalanced fault. We have high-speed digital fault recorders installed around the island, and we actually picked up this record, and the sampling rate of a high-speed digital fault recorder that we have is 7,680 samples per second. And you'll notice here in blue, so in this top blue rectangle, we've got our grid following inverter, voltage and current. And on the bottom, we've got grid forming voltage and current. And to look at the differences here, we had a C phase to ground fault, initial fault. In this transient response that you're seeing here in this red rectangle, you can see the differences in the magnitude of current actually in grid forming is pushing out an unbalanced current. Whereas if you look at the grid following inverter in this transient period, it's actually pushing out almost like a positive sequence. You don't really notice any kind of difference between A, B, and C phase in this transient period. But then when you start looking at the more this kind of steady state, post-transient period, even though we're still in the millisecond range or hundreds of milliseconds, the differences are pretty showing here. Our voltage on C phase, A phase, and B phase, but more so C phase, continues to oscillate in magnitude on the faulted phase. In turn, the current is also oscillating, and you'll see that throughout the event here. And it's oscillating anywhere between 400 and 800 amps of magnitude. Whereas our grid forming inverters, we are still seeing some oscillation, but not to the same extent as we are in the grid following. So that's great, because that means that our frequency with grid forming shouldn't be necessarily as oscillating as it was with all grid following inverters on the island.
All right, Cameron, can I request control, or should I just share my screen?
Why don't you share your screen?
All right, let me know if you guys can.
I don't see anything yet.
Let me try again. It says like my Zoom call is.
It looked like it was trying. Maybe give it one more shot.
As Yeah, I don't know, Zoom crashed for me. Let me try again. Can y'all hear me? And can y'all see the screen?
That's better.
Yep. Go for it.
Yeah. Okay. So with grid farming, like Cameron mentioned, that there are a lot of benefits. It acts it acts as a sink to some of those subsynchronous oscillations. It also can react more quickly to a frequency deviation. Help suppress the DFT, a higher DFTT, as well as prevent any oscillations from happening. A few results we want to share in regards to some other capabilities, specifically for microgrid transitions. And these were performed in Kauai earlier in this June. So this first graph here is frequency versus time. The maroon is the KIUC grid frequency, while the PMRF microgrid is grid tied. We initiated a grid tied to islanded transition, moving from grid connected to a microgrid mode, in other words. It's an automated sequence that's been kind of co-developed between AES and KIUC. So we initiate the sequence, move through the automated transition, and the islanding breaker is opened here. And what you'll see is after we disconnect from the grid with the PMRF naval facility loads, the PMRF microgrid holds its frequency pretty stable and continues powering the PMRF loads. The same thing here with voltage. So the voltage at the bus recorded and disconnect, and that's the microgrid voltage while disconnected from the grid. So that's a planned grid tie to islanded sequence. In theory, it's probably an easier sequence to go through versus something that happens unexpectedly. The next transition is planned islanded back to grid tied. So we start here in microgrid mode. Again, frequency versus time. The blue graph, the blue line here is the microgrid frequency. The black is the KIUC grid frequency recorded. So we're in islanded mode, disconnected from the grid. We initiate a planned islanded back to grid tied transition, go through the sequence. We obviously perform a sync check prior to closing this islanding breaker, bring the frequency and voltage of the microgrid back in range with the KIUC grid, as well as match the phase angle, close the breaker here, and then now we're grid tied, and we continue our dispatch to the grid. So the third transition here is an unplanned seamless islanding, which is more complicated than, I guess, a planned islanding sequence. So we start. So what we've done here is we are trying to replicate a test where where normal operation dispatching to the KIUC grid per dispatch set points that we receive. There could be a fault on the grid that could trigger protection opening. So what we're trying to do here is, and the negative means that's power going into the grid. So we're dispatching about 3.3 megawatts here. So we're dispatching to the grid connected. And what KIUC did was they opened a transmission breaker, which transfer tripped the islanding breaker. And you can see those commands being initiated here. Once the islanding breaker opened, the AES plant had to drop its power output down to match the PMRF naval loads, which were at about 1.1 to 1.5 megawatts. So that's essentially a seamless islanding with no interruption in power to the PMRF loads. In reality, since this was a test, it was kind of manual. We try to make it an unexpected test, but really we are dictating the test by choosing the dispatch, choosing when the breaker opens. It's probably the only way to really test it. in reality though, like when a when a fault happens and protection opens unexpectedly, it does depend on, the type of fault and what the AES plant is doing at that time to help the grid. What are dispatches, how much sun is available. There are a bunch of different conditions, but we have seen that, it's possible to do an unexpected islanding. There are a few scenarios where it might not work out this way, where we remain online. We might actually drop off, go offline, everything goes black, and then we would have to Blackstart. But we're looking at ways to continually improve it. It might never be perfect. I don't think it ever is for any company out there working on seamless transitions, but pretty good enough for now. So that brings me to the last transition. So a load Blackstart essentially means that we're starting with the AES plant shutdown. So that's frequency versus time, voltage per phase, and current per phase. So this is the AES plant grid tied. We open the islanding breaker, shut down the plant, open the islanding breaker so the PMRF base loses power. And we start the load Blackstart sequence somewhere around here. It takes us about 5 to 10 minutes to start up the AES plant. We Blackstart, the PMRF Microgrid Blackstarts, so the AES plant Blackstarts, forms the frequency for the microgrid. And then we sequentially close the PMRF load feeder. So here you can see the inrush for each of those load feeders closing in. So that's the first feeder. And then we energize the second feeder, bring back the base, resume power to them. And then at the end, right over here, we initiated planned islanded back to grid tied to resume normal operation. So I guess that's all to say that grid farming by itself has a lot of advantages, a lot that Cameron spoke about. While we're grid tied, connected to the grid, it offers microgrid advantages, some resiliency through unplanned seamless, and also has a load Blackstart to help dependence on diesel gensets. But real quick, I think, like, my personal opinion is that it's, one of the solutions that is probably required to keep a grid stable, but it's not one solution that fits everything. I think as time goes by, and and me, Cameron, and the rest of the KIUC AES team, we see things every day, and I guess we have to constantly improve. So while it's great that we're seeing solutions like this come into play in reality, and there are a lot of benefits to it, I think it'll be, it's continuous improvement. We keep learning things, and there could be other solutions out there that probably need to be implemented as well. Cameron, you have any closing thoughts? I guess that's our last slide, right?
No, I don't have any. I think the only other thing that I guess to keep the mindset for us is to keep an open mind as we learn more and more about our system. One of the challenges, I think, for us as a utility is that we don't have detailed specific models of every single inverter on our system. And, as industry is going toward EMT type modeling simulations and trying to project or predict what's going to happen under certain conditions to certain, transients on the system, we don't have any of that. And so I think one of the things that has been beneficial in a way is, we had a need to go toward renewable to stabilize our rates, and we've been learning as we've kind of gone and just done it with the intent of saving our membership money. And with that said, we're doing it in a kind of a reliable step progression as we've increased our renewable percentage over the past 10 years. So it's just been, I guess that's where I'll leave it from there.